The cold night in New York felt just like any other for Michael Carter. He adjusted the taxi's rearview mirror and let out a heavy sigh. The city glowed with its blinding lights, but inside the car, only silence filled the space. Another ride, another night trying to scrape together enough money to pay the overdue bills. The rent for his tiny apartment was past due, and the car payments, his only source of income, were piling up like a weight on his shoulders. Suddenly, the radio crackled with a new call. "Driver available on 8th Avenue?" The dispatcher's raspy voice sounded urgent. Michael grabbed the radio and responded, "This is Carter. I'm 2 minutes away." As he turned the corner, he spotted an elderly man leaning against a lamppost, trying to shield himself from the freezing wind. His coat looked worn, and his trembling hands made it clear he wasn't standing there by chance. As soon as Michael pulled over, the man opened the door and climbed in quickly. "Please, sir, I need to get to St. Mary's Hospital as fast as possible. My wife, she's hospitalized, and I don't know how much time I have." Michael glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the man's tear-filled eyes. A pang of empathy hit him in the chest. He knew what it felt like to be powerless. "Don't worry, sir. I'll get you there as fast as I can." Without asking any more questions, Michael stepped on the gas, weaving through the busy streets. As he drove, he could hear the passengers' labored breathing in the back seat. The hospital wasn't far, but every second felt like an eternity. Deep down, something told him this ride wasn't like the others. When they finally reached the hospital entrance, the man fumbled for his wallet with shaking hands. But before he could pull out any money, Michael raised a hand. "It's okay. You don't have to pay." The old man hesitated, surprised, then nodded with a look of genuine gratitude. He hurried out, disappearing through the hospital's glass doors. Michael watched for a moment before sighing and shifting gears. Just another good deed. Just another ordinary night, or so he thought. After that night, Michael went on with his routine. The life of a taxi driver didn't offer much rest. Between rushed passengers, confused tourists, and last-minute rides, the days blurred together like pieces of an endless puzzle. Money was still tight, bills kept stacking up on his kitchen table, and worries hovered over his mind like heavy clouds before a storm. But for some reason, that ride to the hospital wouldn't leave his head. He had dropped off countless passengers at St. Mary's before, but something about that old man felt different. Maybe it was the desperate look in his eyes, maybe the trembling in his hands, or the way his voice carried both urgency and sorrow. Michael couldn't explain it, but he felt like that moment had left an invisible mark. One night, while waiting for another call, he caught himself staring at the back seat. How many stories had passed through there? How many lives had crossed paths with his without him even realizing it? The life of a taxi driver was like that. Quick encounters, silent goodbyes, and an endless cycle of strangers coming and going without a trace. But this time, something had stayed behind, an unsettling feeling he couldn't shake. "Carter, pick up at 42nd and Broadway." The voice on the radio snapped him out of his thoughts. He adjusted the mirror and sighed. Maybe he was just tired. Maybe he was overthinking. After all, at the end of the day, he was just a taxi driver trying to survive in a city that never slept. He shifted gears and sped off through New York's glowing streets, leaving that strange feeling behind. Or at least, he tried, because fate wasn't done with him yet. Winter gave way to spring, and Michael's routine remained the same. Long days, endless nights, and the constant struggle to stay afloat financially. By now, he had almost forgotten about the old man he had driven to the hospital on that freezing night. After all, how many passengers did he pick up each week? Each month? It was impossible to remember them all. Until one random morning, as he sipped his weak coffee in his tiny apartment kitchen, a yellowed envelope landed in his mailbox. No return address, no recognizable sender, just his name, handwritten in shaky yet elegant script. Michael frowned and carefully opened the letter. Inside, a folded piece of paper. The moment he started reading, a lump formed in his throat. "Dear Mr. Carter, I don't know if you remember me. On a cold night, months ago, you drove me to St. Mary's Hospital. My wife was hospitalized. I was desperate, and without hesitation, you refused to take my payment. Maybe to you, it was a simple gesture, but to me, at that moment, it meant everything. That night, I made it just in time to hold her one last time. She passed away later that night, but she left in peace, knowing I was by her side. If I had lost those minutes fumbling for money or waiting for another cab, I might never have had that chance. I never forgot what you did for me, and I never will. You showed me that kindness still exists, even in the chaos of this city. Thank you, from the bottom of my heart. With eternal gratitude, Thomas Reynolds. Michael finished reading and sat there, holding the paper between his fingers, unsure of what to feel. He hadn't expected this. It was just a ride, just a small gesture, and yet, that small act of generosity had given a man the most important moment of his life. The taxi driver sat at the table, staring at the letter as if trying to absorb every word. How many times had he thought that his job didn't matter, that he was just another driver among thousands? But here was proof that without even realizing it, he had made a difference, and that shook him more than he expected. Michael held the letter between his fingers, but it felt like he was holding something much greater. A weight, a lesson, maybe even a purpose he had never seen before. He reread the words, trying to grasp the depth of what had happened. To him, it was just another ride. To Thomas Reynolds, it was a moment that changed everything. And what if he had never taken that call? What if he had insisted on payment? A troubling thought struck him. How many times do we go through life without knowing the impact we have on others? How many stories begin or end because of a simple gesture? Michael stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the city continued in its chaotic rhythm, indifferent to the small stories unfolding every day. He wondered how many other lives he had crossed paths with without even noticing. It was a powerful thought, and an unsettling one. He remembered the countless times he had driven while exhausted, frustrated with traffic, taking out his stress on the job. How many times had he looked at his passengers without really seeing them? Just faceless people, voices giving him a destination, no connection, no meaning. But now he understood that behind every one of them, there was a story, a reason, a life that could be changing in that very moment without him even realizing it. He carefully folded the letter and placed it on the table. He couldn't just ignore this. For years, Michael had seen himself as just a driver trying to make ends meet. But now, for the first time, he wondered if his job was much more than just driving a taxi. Maybe he wasn't just taking people from point A to point B. Maybe without knowing it, he was part of something bigger. He took a deep breath and grabbed his car keys. It was time to get back on the road. But this time, something inside him had changed. Michael hit the streets again that night, but something was different. He no longer saw just passengers. He saw stories. Every person who stepped into his taxi now seemed to carry a greater meaning. The young man in a suit, anxiously talking on the phone. Was he heading to a job interview? The woman with tear-filled eyes in the back seat. Had she just received bad news? The elderly man gazing out the window with a faint smile. Was he reminiscing about a memory from his youth? Before, Michael had driven on autopilot, never thinking twice about who got in or out. But now, he started noticing the details, the expressions, the looks, the subtle emotions that had once gone unnoticed. That very night, a young woman got into his cab. She looked lost, uneasy. "Where to?" Michael asked, noticing the tension on her face. She hesitated, looked down at her hands, fidgeting with her fingers. I don't know." Michael raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" She sighed, struggling to find the words. "I just need a moment. I just want to drive around for a bit." Michael could have just accepted the ride in silence, like he always did. But something inside him wouldn't let him. "You okay?" The young woman looked up at him, surprised. Probably no one had asked her that all day. She gave him a timid smile, but her eyes gave away the truth. "Actually? Not really." Michael just nodded. "Want to talk about it?" There was a brief hesitation. Then the young woman let out a deep sigh. And to his surprise, she started talking. That night, he wasn't just a taxi driver. He was a listener, a stranger who, without even realizing it, gave someone a space to breathe. At the end of the ride, the young woman thanked him with a sincere handshake. "Thank you. I think I just needed someone to ask me that." Michael smiled. "Whenever you need a ride, or just a conversation, You know where to find me." She stepped out of the car, and he sat there for a moment, watching her through the rearview mirror. That night, Michael realized something even deeper. He couldn't change the world, but he could change small moments in someone's life. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Michael Carter's life remained the same, at least on the surface. He still drove the same taxi, still dealt with the same traffic, still struggled to pay the bills, but something inside him had shifted. Now he saw the world differently. Before, his job felt mechanical, just driving, picking up passengers, following routes, and collecting fares. Now, every ride felt like an opportunity. A reminder that he was surrounded by stories, that his presence, even for just a few minutes, could mean something in someone's life. But he still didn't fully understand the impact this would have on his own life. It was late afternoon when he picked up a different kind of passenger. An elderly woman, probably in her 70s, well-dressed, wearing a golden brooch on her blue coat, with a grace in her movements that spoke of a life full of experiences. "Good afternoon, sir," she said with a warm smile as she got into the car. "Good afternoon." "Where to?" "Home, dear." But no rush. Michael found the response unusual. Most passengers were always in a hurry. "Would you like to take a little drive first?" She nodded, gazing out the window with a nostalgic gleam in her eyes. "Yes. It's been so long since I've gone through these streets without worrying about anything." Michael drove at a leisurely pace. Every now and then, the woman sighed as she watched the storefronts, the cafes, the young people rushing down the sidewalks. "You know, driver, I lost my husband a year ago," she said suddenly. Michael felt a pang in his chest. "I'm so sorry." "Thank you." He was a taxi driver, spent his life driving through this city. He used to take me on rides like this. Michael smiled, understanding just how much this moment meant to her. Sounds like he loved what he did. "He always said people underestimate the power of a taxi driver," she continued, still watching the city go by. "He used to say that a simple driver could make someone smile, help them make an important decision, or even give hope to someone who feels forgotten by the world." Michael was silent for a moment. Her words struck a chord. He had never thought of his job that way. But in the past few months, he had started to realize that maybe, just maybe, her late husband was right. When he pulled up in front of her building, she gently held his hand for a moment. "Thank you for the ride. Today, you reminded me of something very important." Michael smiled. "And you reminded me too." The woman stepped out of the car and waved before disappearing into the building. Michael sat there for a few seconds, letting it all sink in. There were no coincidences. He realized that Thomas Reynolds' letter had been just the beginning. What he chose to do with that lesson now was entirely up to him. From that day on, Michael started driving with a new sense of purpose. He was no longer just a taxi driver. He was someone who, in some way, could make a difference. He began paying more attention to the little things. Sometimes a simple, "How was your day?" was enough to break the silence between him and a passenger. Other times, just a genuine smile could change the entire atmosphere inside the car. And then, something curious started happening. Michael began to notice that some rides seemed to have a greater purpose. On a rainy night, he stopped for a passenger who was huddled under an awning, shivering from the cold. When the man got into the car, Michael noticed he was clutching a small envelope. "Where to, sir?" The man sighed and looked down at the envelope as if it weighed a ton. "The address on this paper." Michael took the note and saw an address just a few blocks away. But something about the man's expression made him hesitate before simply driving off. "Is everything okay?" The man let out a bitter laugh. "Honestly? No. I'm on my way to deliver this letter to my son. We haven't spoken in years. Today is his birthday." Michael felt a chill run down his spine. He knew the weight of unspoken words, of regrets left to linger. "I think you're doing the right thing," he said, keeping his eyes on the road. The man remained silent for a while. When they reached the destination, he stared out the window at the modest house, its lights glowing warmly in the night. "What if he doesn't want to see me?" he murmured, hesitant. Michael shrugged. "There's only one way to find out." The man sat there for a moment before letting out a deep breath and opening the door. But before stepping out, he turned to Michael with an earnest look. "Thank you, driver." Then he walked up to the house and knocked on the door. Michael lingered for a few seconds, watching through the window. A young man answered, and for a moment, they just stood there, staring at each other. And then, the impossible happened. The man took a hesitant step forward, and after a brief moment of shock, his son opened his arms. The embrace between them made something tighten in Michael's chest. Without a word, he shifted gears and drove away. He didn't know what would happen after that night, but he knew that, somehow, he had just witnessed a small miracle. And it only reinforced something he was beginning to understand more and more. Sometimes, things happen for a reason. Weeks passed, and Michael kept driving, now with a different perspective on what he did. He felt like he was part of something bigger, even if he couldn't fully explain it. Every passenger who stepped into his taxi carried a story. And in a way, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. But that night, something unexpected happened. He was stopped at a red light when a new call came through the radio. The destination caught his attention. St. Mary's Hospital. His chest tightened. The last time he had been there was the night he had taken Thomas Reynolds. For a moment, he thought about ignoring the call. But an odd feeling made him accept the ride. He navigated through the busy streets toward the hospital, a slight tension in the air. Could this really be a coincidence? When he arrived, the car door swung open, and a young man climbed in, hurried and exhausted. He had dark circles under his eyes, the kind that only came from sleepless nights. "Where to, sir?" Michael asked, turning on the meter. The young man took a deep breath before answering. 8th Avenue, my home." Michael started driving, but he couldn't help noticing that his passenger kept his eyes fixed on the letter in his hands. A yellowed letter, with trembling yet familiar handwriting. His heart skipped a beat. "Are you okay?" Michael asked, trying to mask his unease. The young man hesitated, then sighed. "My name is Ethan Reynolds. I just lost my father." A chill ran down Michael's spine. "Your father? Was his name Thomas Reynolds?" Ethan furrowed his brow, surprised. "Yes. How do you know that?" Michael felt a lump in his throat. Fate truly worked in mysterious ways. "I drove him to the hospital months ago. He wrote me a letter after that." Ethan's eyes widened. "Then, you're the taxi driver from the story?" Michael remained silent. "My father always talked about you. He said he would never forget your kindness that night. He always wanted to thank you in person." The air inside the taxi grew heavy, but not with sorrow. Something deeper, gratitude, connection. And in that moment, Michael realized something. The cycle wasn't over yet. Michael kept driving through the city's glowing streets, but his mind was somewhere else. Thomas Reynolds' son was sitting in the back seat of his car. The same man he had helped months ago, with nothing more than a simple gesture, was now gone. But his story lived on. Ethan remained silent for a long time, just staring at the letter in his hands. It was the same handwriting Michael remembered. "My father always believed that people come into our lives for a reason," Ethan said, breaking the silence. "He used to say that small gestures can change everything." Michael nodded. He understood that now. He was right. Ethan smiled, a sad smile, but full of meaning. "My father was never a man of great wealth, but he had a huge heart. He always said that, in the end, what truly matters isn't what we have, but what we leave behind for others." Michael felt a shiver run through him. It all made sense. He thought about the letter he had received months ago, about the impact those words had on his life, about how one small act of kindness had set off a ripple effect he never could have predicted. And then, Ethan reached into his pocket, pulled out a small envelope, and handed it to Michael. "He wrote this for you before he passed." Michael's heartbeat quickened. A second letter. With trembling hands, he took the envelope and carefully opened it. His vision blurred slightly as he read the words, written in that same steady handwriting, but now carrying the weight of farewell. "Michael, if you're reading this, it means my journey has come to an end. But I wanted you to know that on that day, when you drove me to the hospital, you gave me a gift that no amount of money could ever buy. Time. I got to hold my wife's hand one last time. I got to tell her that I loved her. I got to be with her in her final moments, and that is priceless. You thought you didn't do anything extraordinary, but you did. And maybe that's one of life's greatest lessons. The biggest changes happen through the smallest gestures. I hope you carry that with you. I hope you know that, even without realizing it, you've been touching lives. Keep being that person. The world needs more people like you. With eternal gratitude, Thomas Reynolds. Michael closed his eyes for a moment, letting the emotion wash over him. He had never imagined that something so simple could carry such profound meaning. Ethan watched him with a calm, knowing gaze. He wanted you to know that. Michael took a deep breath, folding the letter carefully, as if holding something precious. I'll never forget. And as he drove Ethan home, he felt that this story wasn't over. In fact, it was only just beginning. Days passed, but Michael knew that something inside him had changed forever. Thomas Reynolds' letter wasn't just a thank you note. It was a reminder that every moment, every choice, every small act of kindness could have a greater impact than we could ever imagine. He kept the letter alongside the first one, like a treasure. Whenever he doubted the value of what he did, he would read those words again and remember what truly mattered. But fate still had one last surprise for him. One morning, as he checked his mailbox, Michael found a different kind of envelope. This time, it wasn't a simple letter. It was an official document sent by a well-known law firm. Frowning, he quickly opened it. And as he started reading, his heart pounded. Mr. Carter, we are writing to inform you that, as stated in the last will and testament of the late Thomas Reynolds, you have been named as a beneficiary of a special fund. Mr. Reynolds wished to express his gratitude in a more tangible way, ensuring that your generosity would never be forgotten. As a token of recognition for the impact you had on his life, a significant sum has been set aside to help you live with greater comfort and security. Please contact us to finalize the necessary arrangements. Michael's hands trembled. This couldn't be real. But it was. Ethan, Thomas's son, confirmed everything. My father always wanted to help those who truly make a difference, Ethan told him. He knew you never expected anything in return. And that's exactly why he wanted to make sure your kindness never went unnoticed. Michael needed time to process everything. He had never imagined that a simple gesture on that freezing night would lead to this. In the months that followed, his life changed. He finally paid off his debts, traded in his old taxi for a more comfortable model, and moved into a larger apartment. But he didn't stop driving. He no longer needed the taxi to survive. Now, he drove because he wanted to. Every ride became an opportunity to give back. If he had once seen his job as just a duty, now he saw it as a purpose. And ironically, with more financial security, he found himself being even more generous. Sometimes he charged less. Other times, he simply offered free rides to those who truly needed them. One night, after a long shift, Michael was about to call it a night when he noticed, across the street, an elderly man struggling to carry heavy grocery bags along the sidewalk. For a moment, he thought of Thomas. Without hesitation, he pulled over and stepped out of the car. "Let me help you, sir." The man looked at him, surprised, but accepted his offer. As Michael carried the bags to the entrance of the building, the old man smiled. "You don't see people willing to help like this every day." Michael smiled back. "I guess someone taught me an important lesson about that." The old man chuckled and patted Michael's shoulder. "The world needs more people like you, son." As he got back into his taxi, Michael glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the elderly man stepping inside his home. It was a simple gesture, but who knew what it might mean to him? And then, as he drove home that night, Michael realized something. Kindness is never lost. It always finds a way to come back. And in that moment, he knew he would never see his job the same way again. Because in the end, he wasn't just a driver. He was part of something much bigger. And he always would be.